Hi, this is a video on logical fallacies. It's in my series of, I'm kind of doing lectures that would go through a philosophy course from a Christian, at least one Christian perspective. I've already done a video on is philosophy Christian at all? And then I did a 2.1 video, which was on the tests for truth, the correspondence truth test, the coherence test, and the pragmatic test. Now we want to continue and finish our section of this series on logic by talking about logical fallacies. Now, I have these twin, I hold these twin beliefs with regard to logic. On the one hand, I believe that logic is universal. That is to say, that the way that we talk about stuff, the way we communicate, the way we argue, that there's a real cultural dimension to what we find convincing and how we can persuade people and how we formulate, our thoughts. That's true, that in communication there is that. I believe, however, that there is a fundamental logic to the universe that applies in all times and all places. I believe it applies in China. I believe it applies in Russia. I believe it applies in Africa or Australia or in North America or Europe. Truth is the truth, I believe, in terms of what we might call micro reason or logic. And the reason I believe this is because the fundamental basis for logic is, it seems to me, at least two things. One is cause and effect, which is true anywhere you go. If you get hit with a rock, things happen. And that's going to happen no matter whether you're in China or Africa. You get hit with a rock in the head, certain things are going to happen. And so cause and effect is a universal phenomenon. I assume it's the same in Andromeda or Alpha Centauri. So because a lot of logic has to do with cause and effect, I therefore believe it's universal. Another aspect of logic is what we might call general and particular. The idea that you can have a broad category and then things that fit entirely within that general category. And so this relationship between general and particular is intrinsic to the universe and therefore logic. So I won't go into details on those sorts of things, but I believe that logic, now this may be very cultural in the way that I'm expressing it in this video, but I believe it is a distillation. Maybe there's another way to do it, but this is a distillation of reason that would apply anywhere in the universe. So I hold that truth. The other truth that I hold that's in tension with that is my very strong conviction that the human animal is not very logical. That is to say that we use language to try to persuade each other. We use arguments all the time to try to get from A to B. But in the end, we are not really rational animals. Human beings are herd animals. We tend to group, we tend to clique, we tend to tribe, and we use our reason primarily to justify what we already believe. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind that I think plays this out very well. He compares our reason to a rider on an elephant. I may have said this in the previous video. And the elephant, the rider reason, can sway the elephant a little bit, but most of the time the elephant's going to go where it wants to go. And in fact, the rider pretty much, the job of the rider is to come up with justifications for where the elephant wants to go. Occasionally we do run into walls. And I think there are plenty of people who can run into a wall, I'm metaphorical here, can run into a wall and say, no, there's still no wall there. You just ran into it. Your nose is bloody. There is no wall there. I mean, the human animal is fundamentally irrational. This is my firm conviction. And so I find myself, this is a depressing situation to be in, to believe that logic is universal and yet to believe that human beings are fundamentally illogical, fundamentally irrational. And, it's not about intelligence. In fact, you could argue, and I would argue, that a lot of times really, really intelligent people are simply able to fool themselves better than people who maybe aren't as intelligent. What I mean is an intelligent person can come up with more sophisticated rationalizations for what they already want to do. A person can get a PhD so that they can, so that they have the credentials to support the position they had before they ever knew anything about the subject. So this is a very kind of strange position for me to have, to believe that logic is universal and that it's important, and yet to believe that that I'm probably not going to convince you. In fact, as I look through the illustrations I'll probably use, I'll probably tick some people off because people will say, no, you're wrong there. Or you might, maybe I'm doing the same thing. You're welcome. You know, I have this saying, the truth doesn't care. And what I mean by that is that if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It doesn't matter whether my feelings get hurt. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. By the same token, you can get angry, but if you're wrong, you're wrong. And you know, you're getting angry doesn't matter as far as the truth is concerned. Well, okay, let's dig into these fallacies, shall we? There are formal fallacies and there are informal fallacies. Formal fallacies mean that the logic is invalid. What do I mean by that? Well, you see a syllogism, which I talked about in the previous video on tests for truth. A syllogism can have a valid logic to it. A valid logic means that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow. Here's a valid syllogism. All men are purple. Steve is a man. Therefore, Steve is purple. This is a valid syllogism. However, it's not true. An argument can be valid and yet be false, as in this case, because the logic works perfectly. We have all men are purple. That's a general statement. Steve is a man. That's a specific statement contained within the general statement. Therefore, Steve is purple. We've applied the general truth to the specific within the group. This is a valid syllogism because the logic works. It, however, is a false conclusion. Why? Because one of the premises is wrong. Steve may be a man, but not all men are purple, at least not when purple is used in the normal sense. And so the logic of a syllogism can be valid and yet the syllogism be false if one of the premises is in fact false. Of course, it goes the other way as well. An argument can be invalid and yet true. And so you could, I think of Monty Python, where this woman is on trial for being a witch, and they're trying to reason it out. You know, let's see, what else? If we throw her into the water, if she floats, you know, what does that mean? Well, what things float? Well, small rocks, a duck floats. You know, anyway. So if she weighs as much of a duck, then she's a witch. You know, the logic is completely wrong and invalid. And yet, when she's found guilty, what does she say? She says, "Oh, it's a fair cop." In other words, she actually is a witch. And so the conclusion that they drew, that she's a witch, was true, even though their logic getting there was completely invalid. Okay, well, so this also highlights the fact that there's a difference between what is practical and what is logical. Logical has to do with what must be the case logically. What the conclusion, a conclusion that you must reach. Logic says this is the conclusion you must reach if the premises are true. However, in the real world, we don't necessarily deal with logical certainties. In the real world, we deal with probabilities. And so it may very well be the case that something is probable, even if it is not a logical necessity. Hold that thought. We'll return to it in a moment. Let me give you an example of a formal fallacy where the logic doesn't work. When it rains, the road gets wet. This is often the case. Yesterday it rained, the road got wet. Of course, there could be a road that goes through a tunnel, and the road probably doesn't get wet in the tunnel when it rains outside the tunnel. So we already have found a slight kink in the armor of this, well, with regard to the truth of this. We've only had one premise, so we haven't found out whether the logic is invalid. It's going to be. But we've already have one chink in the truth of this, because there may be a case that it might rain and a road not get wet. The road is wet, okay? it must have rained. Now this is invalid. Why? Because there are other ways for roads to get wet. So a road can get wet because a water truck crashed, and or maybe they're spraying it down because they're laying something on it. So this is invalid. In fact, it has a name: the fallacy of affirming the consequent, because the logic simply doesn't work here. And so sometimes I've had students who I've asked them on a philosophy midterm, to come up with a valid syllogism, not necessarily a true one. And sometimes they come up with really funny syllogisms that aren't true, but unfortunately they've done something like this here. It's important for this to be contained as a specific version of the general statement, and it just doesn't work here. Okay, so formal fallacies are fallacies where the logic is invalid. Of course, there are a ton of informal fallacies. This is, of course, where the premises don't support the conclusion, but these are less tied to specific reasons for the logic, and they're more in a more general nature. The first one I want to mention is the fallacy of hasty generalization. This is where you jump to conclusions. How many parents, including myself, have jumped to conclusions because we assumed that a child has done something, when in fact the child hasn't done something? Now maybe the child has given us plenty of reason to think that, they probably did this because of past experience. But hasty generalization is where you jump to conclusions without having enough evidence to do so. And so you took too long. You must have gone by Starbucks. Well, maybe I did go by Starbucks. There's the fact that sometimes it's true, even though you're being illogical. But, there are lots of reasons why I might have taken too long. I might have gotten stuck in traffic, or I might have had a phone call at the last minute. And so you parents out there, don't jump to conclusions. Take some time to gather the evidence so that you know for sure that the child has done what you think they've done. So the fallacy of hasty generalization. This is why one of the things I love about the American Constitution is that you're innocent until proven guilty. That whole thing about innocent until proven guilty keeps us from hasty generalization and jumping to conclusions. This is why it is wrong, to go out and kill somebody because you think that they've killed somebody, and so forth. We don't jump to conclusions in the law. We do as people all the time. But in terms of the law must have evidence, and a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. Isn't this great about our system? On a grassroots level, sometimes people don't want to wait. They get upset. They want to rush to judgment, but in America, we don't hasty generalize as a matter of law. The fallacy of subjectivism is basically where just because you want something to be true doesn't make it true. He's still alive. I just know it. Well, it doesn't matter whether you think he's alive or not. Either he is alive or he's not alive. And what you think doesn't matter. Sometimes people have asked me, why should I believe in God? And frankly, the best answer is because God exists. It doesn't really matter whether you have a reason or not. If God exists, God exists. And it doesn't matter, well, I'm not convinced. Well, he doesn't disappear. If you say, I'm not convinced there's a God, God doesn't, oh no, poof. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. Same way, of course, if you believe God exists and he doesn't, it doesn't matter. One way or another, either God exists or God doesn't exist. This is the whole idea of objective truth versus subjective truth. Subjectivity has to do with what I think. Well, in my opinion, this coffee tastes great. And in your opinion, this coffee tastes horrible. That's a matter of opinion. That's subjective. But the fact that this is a coffee mug with coffee in it is objective. It doesn't matter, well, I don't think that's a coffee mug. I don't think there's coffee in there. It doesn't matter what you think. The truth, objective truth, is either true or false, and it really doesn't matter what you think about it. Something is not true just because you want it to be true. And something is not false just because you want it to be false. Well, I'm going to win the lottery. I just know it. I just don't think so. No, you're probably not going to. Well, maybe you will. But what you want to happen or what you think is going to happen, it doesn't matter. An asteroid just hit Texas. Did it? I mean, there are ways to find this sort of thing out. But it doesn't matter whether it's actually, sometimes when I'm flying on a plane, I went through a period where I would get really nervous flying on a plane. I got to where I'd tell myself, you know what? I couldn't make this plane if I want. I couldn't make this plane crash if I wanted it to. In other words, it really doesn't matter whether I think the plane's going to crash or not. Either the plane's going to fly or it's not going to fly, and I'm irrelevant, to that. There is such a thing as objective truth. You could fall off of a building and say, well, I just don't believe I'm going to go splat when I hit the ground. Now, it doesn't really matter what you think. You're probably going to go splat depending on how high up you were. There could, of course, be some strange gust of wind that blows you through a window and you just break a leg, maybe. But probably, if you've fallen off a 10-story building, it really doesn't matter what you think about what's going to happen. You're probably going to go splat. Okay, that's called objective truth. Appeal to emotion. We're kind of in the same vein here of some of these fallacies. Appeal to emotion is kind of the Debbie Boone fallacy. It can't be wrong because it feels so right. Well, yes, it can. Doesn't matter how you feel as far as what is objectively truth. This is kind of similar to the subjective one, although this one has more to do with emotion. You realize if you vote for X, he or she's going to take away your Y. Well, you can stir people's up emotion. I knew the speaker was right because the way the crowd got all stirred up. Well, really, emotion. I'm going to go Spock on this one. Emotion really is irrelevant to objective truth. Now, I'm not saying emotion isn't real. Emotion is real. Perception is reality in a way because people act in accordance to what they perceive. Feelings do matter. And it would be illogical not to take feelings into account because feelings do matter. But in terms of what is true, whether or not it's raining or not, let's say I don't want it to rain today. I'm sorry, it's raining today, but I don't want it to. Again, I need to be tactful. I need to learn tact. There's a time to say things. There's a time not to say things. But I'm sorry, whether or not it's raining outside or not doesn't matter about your crying. You know what I'm saying? I've never done that, by the way. I'm a much better parent than that. But what in fact, and by the way, neuroscientists tell us that the more emotional we are, the less objectively and clearly we think. From a neurophysiological perspective, emotion clouds our thinking. It clouds our judgment. Now, it gives us motivation, it gives us passion, it gives us focus, but it doesn't help us think better. In fact, there was one morning I drove into, I was teaching Greek, and I was upset about something I was hearing on the news. And I was dropping forms that I wouldn't normally drop after getting my brain chemicals stirred up. Emotions don't help you think in general. They cloud your thinking. Anger, sadness, depression. These things make it more difficult to think logically. But basically, something isn't true just because it stirs up your emotions. Again, whether or not it's raining outside or not depends on, wait for it, whether or not it's raining outside or not how I feel about it. Okay, appeal to force. These all fit in a similar category, these first ones here. Sometimes people try to force other people to agree with them, as if your superior power determines what is really true. No, this is reassuring to me. You know what? God knows what is true. God knows what is true. And it doesn't matter whether I can win the day in terms of eternity. This is great assurance to me. I may be wrong on many things, but you know what? God knows what's true. And when I get to heaven, God's going to sit me down and I'll know when I was right and when I was wrong. There's some people who are very, very passionate about what they believe is true. And you know what? If they're right, that's great. But when they get to heaven, it doesn't matter whether they won the vote or whether they won the war or whatever they won the election or whatever. When they get to heaven, God is going to tell them what's right, and there will be no talk back. There will be no bickering back to God in heaven. Now, either, if, let's say you and I are having an argument, and let's say one of us rights, one of us wrong. Let's say one of us wins and one of us loses. In heaven, God will tell us the right answer, and we won't be able to bicker. Because God is God and he has the final say. Every knee will bow, every tongue confess, and that is the end of the story. No matter whether you're Mao Zedong or Hitler, doesn't matter, Mussolini, doesn't matter whether you won, whether you lost. In heaven, God sits you down and says, no, or yes, or yes. Okay, appeal to force. What I'm saying is true or I'll beat you up. That doesn't make it true. Carnegie has a saying that I like. A man convinced against his will is of the same mind still. You can't make someone agree with you. You can make them say they agree with you. Galileo, if you don't recant this idea of the sun going around the earth, if you don't recant this idea of the earth going around the sun, we will burn you at the stake. And Galileo says, you know what? You're right. What was I thinking? Of course the sun goes around the earth, but Galileo really didn't believe that the sun goes around the earth. And so you can force someone to say they agree with you, but you can't force someone to agree with you. There's some people who are very logical in some respects who I think don't get the fact that you just sometimes can't persuade someone to your position. I was in a committee meeting once where me and this other fellow, we agreed and everybody else disagreed with us. And my friend, he just kept wanting to argue. He felt like if I could just explain it a little bit better, then everybody will agree with me. And I said to the person out in the hall, I said, you know what? I agree with you, but we don't have the votes. We've lost the votes. That's the end. There was a vote taken. We lost. And in fact, the person kept trying to persuade the committee. No, I'm sorry I have to leave because I want to explain it better to you. And someone very bluntly said, we understand you. We don't agree with you. And so you just can't force, reason is not going to force a lot of people to agree with you, even if you're right. In fact, there's a book on leadership. I'm sorry I'm doing all these tangents, but there's a book called The Making of a Leader by Bobby Clinton. And he says somewhere about 2/3 through the book that at one point he realized that the group with the greater power usually wins even when they're wrong. And I read the book and I laughed out loud. I said, well, duh, of course. There is a certain personality that thinks, no, if I can just explain a little better, I'm right. But I'm sorry. You cannot force somebody to believe in the truth. Okay. Or you can't force them to believe something false either necessarily. This goes back to what I said at the beginning of the video about how we're herd animals. Appeal to the majority. So something isn't true just because most people, or even all people, believe it. Now, I live in kind of a democratic, we're a representational democracy, fine. But we live in a kind of democracy where we get to vote, but just because the majority votes on something doesn't make it right. The majority isn't always right. Again, one of the things I love about the American Constitution is it has protections for the minority. The Constitution has protections for the individual. The majority of Americans can't say, we're going to kill everybody with red hair. Even if the majority votes that, we can't do it because the Constitution protects the individuals within our society. But the basic principle here is that just because most people vote for something even if all people voted for something, that doesn't make it true. The majority may win a vote, but the majority does not get to vote on truth because if something's true, it's true. Doesn't matter whether you think it's true or false. Common sense, by the way, is often cultural. What we call common sense is often things that we were taught as a child. We don't remember, things we caught as a child. We don't remember catching them. It's wrong to eat cat. Well, why? Everybody knows it's wrong to eat cat. Duh. A lot of times when you get emotional and you say, of course, everybody knows you don't do that. Everybody knows that you roll the toilet paper from the top. Are you stupid? A lot of times when we don't have an answer, it's because we've hit cultural pay dirt and we don't even remember, being taught that. So the majority is not always right. Here's another one: appeal to improper authority. Not everybody's an expert. Now, of course, experts aren't always right. Experts and bodies of experts change their positions on things from time to time. But I do think that the American culture, our pioneer frontier culture, has a particular bent toward rejecting experts. This is really illogical, because if you think about it, the most likely people to know the truth on an issue are the people who know the most about that issue, right? And yet, for some reason, American culture almost, I mean, the way we treat nerd, you're a nerd, you know how to do math, you must be stupid. I mean, think about that for a second. You know how to do math, you must be stupid. That's the way we treat the most likely person to know the truth on an issue is the person who's an expert on that issue. So don't come and ask, Ken, tell me about the price of eggs in China. I don't know anything about the price of eggs in China. Even if I have an opinion, you probably shouldn't listen to me. And so the most likely person to know the right answer on any subject is an actual expert on that subject. Now, again, this is not a guarantee, but often people appeal to the improper authority. So, for example, take the science of evolution. Now, just because the majority of biological scientists think that simple life developed into complex life over time, that doesn't make it true, because that would be appeal to the majority. However, I'm not somebody who's particularly qualified my opinion on the science of evolution really doesn't matter, because I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biological scientist. And let's be honest, the opinion of a pastor, your typical pastor, on evolution really doesn't matter as far as the science is concerned. Now, I realize that we have this question of the Bible, but let me tell you, as an expert on the Bible, there is such a thing as an expert on the Bible. And after doing quite a number of years of study, let me just say that your average pastor is probably not really an expert on the original meaning of the Bible. Now, hopefully your pastor knows what the Lord has been speaking to the church in Scripture. But there is this thing called what it meant 2,000 years ago. And to really be an expert on that, you need to know Greek, and you need to know Hebrew, and you need to know the evidence from ancient culture. You need to know the Dead Sea Scrolls. You need to, this sort of thing. And there aren't that many pastors who are actually experts on the original meaning of the Bible. And so there are experts, and appeal to improper authority is something we do quite a lot. In fact, Americans have a tendency to feel like everybody's opinion counts the same. And that's just not true. The average opinion of a person on math, on calculus, well, what's your opinion about that definite integral? The opinion that somebody might have on that in general probably doesn't matter. This is appeal to improper authority as an informal kind of fallacy. Okay, now we're going to get more and more refined in these fallacies. The AdHominem fallacy. The AdHominem fallacy is where you attack a person. This is done all the time in politics, where you attack the person making a claim rather than the claim. But again, whether or not something that someone is saying is true or false depends on what? Wait for it. Whether or not it's true or false. Whether or not something someone is saying is true or false depends on whether or not it's true or false, not on the person saying it. Satan, right? Satan can say stuff that's true. Satan quotes scripture in Luke and Matthew 4. And so whether or not a claim is true depends on, wait for it, whether or not the claim is true. I remember back in the 2016 election, Ted Cruz came to Marion, Indiana, of all places. And he was making some argument. I don't remember what his argument was. It might have been a good argument. It might have been a bad argument. I don't even remember what the argument was. But this fellow that he was talking to would not listen to him. He just said, "Lying Ted, lying Ted." Just started name calling him. This is something the current president is very good at, coming up with little hand Marco coming up with these little kind of cliches to dismiss people with slow Steve, or whatever. But of course, calling someone lying Ted is not an actual argument against their particular position. Name calling is the worst logic. I mean, that's not a logical argument at all. And so the ad hominem fallacy attacks the person rather than the thing that they're actually arguing. Related to this is something called the circumstantial fallacy. A circumstantial fallacy basically says, I have circumstantial evidence, but I didn't witness it. Let's say that when my son was a boy, that he'd gotten into a cookie jar, and let's say that there's a cookie jar and the lid is off and there are cookies missing and there are crumbs, and the crumbs go right into the living room where there is my son, and he has chocolate around his face. Now, I did not see him take the cookie, but the circumstantial evidence is all pointing toward him taking the cookie. Now, here's a difference between practical and logical. The fact that I have this circumstantial evidence, does it prove logically that he took the cookie and ate it? No, it doesn't. That's the circumstantial fallacy. Now, practically speaking, I think it's pretty probable, that he did. But there are other possibilities. What if his sneaky sister, is over there smiling? What if she framed him? What if she took a cookie, spread the crumbs, wiped his face, unsuspecting to him because he was playing a video game, and then framed him? Dad, Tom took a cookie. So circumstantial evidence does not logically prove the case, although it may be still probable. So in court cases, we talk about circumstantial evidence. Now, circumstantial evidence, I think more often than not, is what convicts people. But generally, people consider witness evidence more direct. Well, it is more direct and more substantial than circumstantial evidence. Although, as we now know, witness evidence is often notoriously unreliable as well. Even more so, I would say in some cases. Well, here we get to that whole idea of practical versus logical. Remember the story of the boy who cried wolf? Now, because the boy has a pattern of crying wolf, you can say, well, he's probably crying wolf again, but he might not be. So in the practical world, there can be a probability that someone is lying, for example, even though you can't prove it. By the way, this ad hominem fallacy, like I said, it's done all the time in politics to dismiss people. Now, so for example, our current president has been accused in the past of sleeping around and of a number of things. There are those who have, I've seen these videos where you see he says one thing and then he says another, and then he's, these sorts of things. Let's say, and I know some people won't buy it, but let's say that our current president has some character issues. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say that. But if you don't want to say that, talk about Hillary Clinton or Obama or Bill Clinton, pick your president. Here's the ad hominem fallacy. Just because a person has a character problem doesn't necessarily mean that they have a bad foreign policy or that they have a bad immigration policy or whatever. I personally think the president has a horrible immigration policy. But you see what I'm saying? The character of a person actually doesn't logically imply that a position they take on a particular issue is good or bad. Whether or not the position a politician takes on a given issue is good or bad depends on, wait for it, whether or not their position is good or bad. It doesn't depend on their character or whether they sleep around or used to sleep around. So that's the ad hominem fallacy. The ad hominem fallacy attacks the person rather than the argument. Okay, another one is the genetic fallacy. Why a person believes something or where a belief comes from does not technically speak to whether it's true or false. So Karl Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, that it just dulls everybody's pain and helps them, cope in life. Freud believed that we were looking for a big daddy, to take care of us, and that's why people believed in God. Now, I'm not going to say that they're right, but I will say this: why a person believes in God doesn't prove whether or not there's a God or not. Whether or not there's a God or not depends on, wait for it, whether or not there's a God or not why so-and-so believes or disbelieves in whether there's a God. So that's the genetic fallacy. The reason why someone believes something doesn't necessarily tell us whether what they believe is true or false. Okay, fallacy of ignorance. Just because something can't be proved doesn't mean it's false. You ever heard the person who says, prove it, you can't prove it? Now, that does matter in law. In the court, it matters whether you can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. But in terms of whether something's true or not, just because you can't prove that the mafia killed a bunch of people doesn't mean that the mafia didn't kill a bunch of people. Or as one of my colleagues says, absence of presence is not presence of absence. So, you know, there really is not archaeological evidence for the destruction of Jericho at the time of Joshua. Now, there's archaeological evidence for destruction several thousand years before, like in 3000 BC, Jericho, we have evidence of a destruction there. But there really isn't a clear archaeological evidence of a destruction of Jericho in the time of Joshua. Does that mean that it didn't happen? Not necessarily, no. Because, as my friend Wilbur Williams would say, absence of presence is not presence of absence. And so just because you can't prove something doesn't mean it isn't true. And I'll leave it at that. Okay, fallacy of false alternative. When someone says it's either A or B, when in fact there's another C. People do this all the time as well, and it happens in politics a lot. We simplify things. You know, the human brain can only handle so much complexity. And so we tend to simplify things. And a lot of times the simplest account wins, even though the truth is complex. There's so many moving parts to the universe, right? The truth of the universe is often, and the truth of any situation or the truth of an individual person. We talk about flat characters in a story, completely predictable characters, as opposed to round characters who are more real, like real people. Most people aren't or a saint. Ding, most of us are kind of a mixture of stuff, and so. But there's a human tendency to simplify things down to really it's either this or that. But often that's the fallacy of false alternative. Either you're a conservative or a liberal. No, there's all. I mean, what is a conservative? A conservative is someone who resists change in some area. But there's all kinds of different areas of conservative. So a conservative in Russia might be you could have a conservative communist, who wants to go back to the good old days of Soviet Russia. You know what I'm saying? A liberal is somebody who wants to free things up, and often progressive. Change is more associated with liberal. There's all kinds of gradations. What do these even mean? Depends on the context what these mean. So a liberal. I'm wearing short sleeves today. 70 years ago in the Wesleyan Church, I'd look at that liberal wearing a short sleeve. I mean, you see what I mean? The situations change. And so there's all kinds of gradations. This is not an either or kind of thing. That's the fallacy of false alternative. Either you believe in absolutes or you don't believe in right and wrong at all. No, not at all. An absolutist, absolutes with regard to ethics, absolutes means no exceptions. So when Peter says to the Sanhedrin, you decide whether we should obey God or you. And so, Peter says in 1 Peter, or in 1 Peter it says, submit to the authorities. And yet Peter doesn't submit to the authorities. What is this? What? Peter sinned? No, Peter doesn't consider submission to authorities an absolute. He makes an exception. Absolutes mean no exceptions. And so obeying those in authority over you is not an absolute by definition, because there are times when God commands us to make exceptions to the absolute. Even relativists believe in right and wrong. They just believe it's relative. And so somebody who says, I believe that it's wrong for me to drink, but it's not necessarily wrong for so-and-so else to drink moderately, that person is saying there is a right or wrong for me. It's just not the same right or wrong for this other person who drinks moderately over here. Moral nihilism is the belief that there is no right and wrong at all. So there are all kinds of gradations between absolute and nihilism on the spectrum. But this is the typical kind of simplification that we do to help us, get around complex realities. But in fact, this is a massive fallacy of false alternative. Here's another one. Either every word of the Bible is true or none of it is. Well, again, this is a false alternative. There's often a hidden premise in here. There's a little circular reasoning here sometimes, and that is that God inspired the Bible in a particular way. That's usually a hidden premise, a hidden assumption in here. But there are parts of the Bible that are absolutely essential to Christian faith as we know it. That God raised Jesus from the dead, for example. That Jesus he arose. That's absolutely essential. But a blind man a blind man was in Jericho. There could be all kinds of verses. I mean, I'm not arguing for the falsity of the Bible, by the way. Here, I'm simply saying that this is a false alternative. You could say, I'm not arguing for this at all, but you could say that there was no guy named Phineas. I'm not arguing for this at all. You might say there was no guy named Phineas. That doesn't mean, every other word of the Bible is false. You see what I'm saying? That I'm having trouble even explaining how this. Anyway, I'm moving on. So related to the fallacy of false alternative is the slippery slope fallacy, or you might call it the give an inch and it'll take a mile fallacy. Now, actually, in practicality, this can be true. It can be true that if you give in, then people will tend to try to take more. I know we had a president once that wanted to keep the argument on whether or not we should dance or not. Why? Because if we gave into dancing, then we'd be arguing about drinking. And so to stop the slippery slope, we weren't allowed to dance. There may be some practical truth to the idea of slippery slopes, but logically, it's not necessary. What if, because, maybe the slide ends here, or maybe it isn't even a slide. So the slippery slopes can be real in the real world, but logically, they're not a sure thing. Just because you allow this doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly we're going to go all the way down here. Okay, let me go back to here. I was having trouble formulating an example here. Every word of the Bible is true or none of it is. Let's say that it turns out that there was not a guy named Phineas who was priest. Does that mean, then Jesus must not have existed? I mean, you see what I'm saying? That just doesn't make any sense. There are all kinds of possibilities in between. Okay, the fallacy of diversion. The fallacy of diversion is where you change the subject. This is changing the subject and missing the point. And again, this is just politics does this all the time. During election season, somebody's being interviewed on the news by the media, and they're asked a question or in a debate, and they go somewhere else. This is done all the time. It's like, look at the shiny thing over here, and maybe you won't notice that I'm not answering your question. This is called the fallacy of diversion. I personally believe that a lot of the discussion over athletes kneeling during the Pledge of Allegiance has been a diversion. So, for example, somehow or another, we got from, if they're kneeling during the Pledge of Allegiance, they're disrespecting all of our troops who are dying in battle overseas. I really don't think that that's what the kneeling was about. The kneeling wasn't about, we shouldn't have our troops, there's a big jump there. The kneeling was to call attention to these athletes believing that inequities exist, racial inequities exist in American culture. As far as I can remember, none of them did it because we don't like what our troops are doing overseas. That's a completely different subject. And so this is kind of like, watch me pull a rabbit out of a hat. This is a changing of the subject. I also often find that whenever on Facebook, whenever you bring up a particular moral issue that is an unpopular one, I have some friends who actually counted how long it took to get from this issue over here. Maybe you're talking about poverty, or maybe you're talking about immigrants, or maybe you're talking about some issue over here. Almost without a doubt, somebody will bring up abortion, even though that's a completely different subject. Couldn't it be that there are more than one moral issue? Abortion is a real issue. Abortion is a legitimate item that we should be working to bring to an end, okay? But what about these other issues? This is a diversion tactic. It reminds me of in a movie, a guy sits down, is at a wedding, sits next to this older fellow, and he says, "Hi, my name is such and such." And the guy says, "Don't be ridiculous. My brother died, several years ago." He says, "Well, maybe I'm a different, person." "No, I know who my brother is." I mean, changing the subject. Often done. Don't fall prey to it. If somebody's giving an argument, listen to the argument, weigh the argument. Is the argument true or false? Don't follow the shiny object. "Oh, look over that." Oh, that's the fallacy of diversion. Mark Twain once said that there were lies, lies, and statistics. I think statistics are often used in political speech to try to distract. And statistics can be made to prove anything, one person once said. You have to be very careful with statistics because they can be made to appear to point in a direction that's not the right direction. Okay, what did I have down there? Straw man argument. Okay, good. I'm glad I did this. I can't see the bottom there. So the straw man argument is where you don't represent the opponent's argument quite right. You have a simplified version of it that's not quite accurate. We do this all the time when we're arguing with people. This is what a person is like this. A lot of times we underestimate the intelligence of the person we're arguing against because we've made a pretend version of them or a pretend version of their position. This often happens in an echo chamber. So like, let's say you only watch MSNBC or you only watch Fox News. Chances are you're going to get a straw man of the other side because these are kind of like echo chambers where you just hear fed back at you what you already think. I sometimes use let's take The Rock, muscular guy. I'm not going to be able to beat up The Rock, I guarantee you. But if you made a paper mache rock, maybe I could. Man, I'm beating The Rock. Look, bam, his head's off. Okay, it's much harder to beat up the real Rock than it is to beat up a paper version of The Rock. That's the straw man argument. You're not actually fighting the real position. You're fighting a caricature of the real position. Getting close to the end. Fallacy of equivocation. This is where you switch the meaning of a word in the middle of an argument. So the fallacy of diversion changes the subject. The fallacy of equivocation changes the meaning of the word you're talking about. You may have heard the old one, "Can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it?" Now this sounds like a double bind. If you say, "No, he can't," that sounds like there's something he can't do. But if you say, "Yes, he can," then it sounds like there's something he can't do. But I think the secret is that the word "can" is being used in two different ways in these two places. So can in the first place means something like, is it possible that God could create a rock so big that he would not be powerful enough to lift it? Now, when you word it that way, you say, no, God can lift every rock. God can make a rock as big as he wants, and God can lift any rock he makes. To say that God is omnipotent means that he can lift every rock and he can make as big a rock as he wants. And so therefore it is not possible for God to create a rock so big he can't lift it, because if he could, he would not be omnipotent. So it's a play on the word "can," I think here. It makes you think that God can't do something, but it's really just a trick. Here's an interesting thought I had once upon a time. When we take the Bible out of context, we are changing its meaning. So when we quote a verse for today that meant something different in its original context, we are taking that verse out of context. So Paul told husbands to be the head of the house. Actually, he doesn't actually tell it. He describes it. The husband is the, but anyway, so does that mean today what it meant when Paul said it? Or has the meaning somewhat changed? So when we take scripture out of context, we are committing the fallacy of equivocation, because we're taking words that meant something in one situation and we're taking them and applying them in a different situation. By the way, I think this applies to actions as well. In my New Testament textbook, I say, doing what they did isn't doing what they did if the meaning of the act is different. So if I were to go up to people in my church and start greeting the brothers with a holy kiss, it's not going to mean the same thing that it meant in the Bible. I'm actually taking those verses out of context, I think, if I try to apply them to today. Okay, begging the question. I think we have 2 or 3 more here. Begging the question is sometimes called circular reasoning. This is where you assume your conclusion in your argument. The Bible is inspired because it says so. Now, I believe the Bible is inspired, but you understand that this is a bad argument because what if I write down Ken knows everything, Ken is inspired. You know, I can write that down, but just because I write it down doesn't make it true. The statement in 2 Timothy that all Scripture is God-breathed is in Scripture. And so if I say Scripture is inspired because it says it's inspired, I'm assuming my conclusion that Scripture is inspired within my argument. I'm going to need some kind of external demonstration of that if I want to prove it. Now, of course, for me, it's a matter of faith, and so I don't have to prove it. But as far as a logical argument is concerned, this is a circular argument. The moral, now again, you don't have to agree with me, although I don't see how you can argue it. I think I'm right. The moral argument for the existence of God and the problem of evil argument for the existence of God basically says that the moral argument, God has to exist because otherwise there'd be no basis for right and wrong. I actually agree with that, I think. However, usually this argument has the premise, and there is a right and wrong, therefore there must be a God. Well, how do you prove that there is such a thing as right and wrong? I've heard the moral argument used on the assumption that there's a right and wrong, but this argument doesn't work unless you can prove that there is a right and wrong. And so I think sometimes there's a subtle circular reasoning to the moral argument. The moral argument gives us a reason to want there to be a God, but it doesn't prove that there's a God unless we can demonstrate that there is right and wrong. Okay, post hoc propter hoc. This is after this because of this. This is the idea that just because B happened after A doesn't mean that A caused B. Let's say that I come out of a building and then the building explodes. That doesn't necessarily mean that I caused the explosion. Now, maybe I did, but you can't prove it just because it happened after I came out. He became president and unemployment went down. Now, maybe the president in some way, whoever it is, caused unemployment to go down, but there could be other reasons. Here's we have a saying: correlation is not causation. Just because two things go down together doesn't mean that one of them is causing the other to go down. There can be coincidence. There can be a common cause behind both of them. Maybe employment was already going down when the person became president. So logically, you can't prove it just because there's a correlation. You have to show a material cause-effect connection between. Okay, this is the final fallacies. Fallacies of composition and division. Supposing that what is true of a part must be true of a whole, or that what is true of a whole must be true of its parts. So, for example, this is the fallacy of prejudice. So you say, you're a white person, Ken. You did this, therefore all white people must be like this. You're like this, Ken, and you're a white person. Therefore, all people must be like this because you're white. That's not usually the way the argument goes, but you see that is the fallacy of composition, where you assume that because one person in a group thinks or does a certain way, then therefore everybody in that group thinks or does a certain way. It can also go the other way around. So, for example, you can say Wesleyans tend to do this. Therefore, since Ken's a Wesleyan, he must do that. Now, if it's a thing that all Wesleyans do this, Ken's a Wesleyan, then yes, Ken does do that. But there are all kinds of idiosyncrasies. Let's say that you meet 10 Wesleyans and they all have big noses, and you say, Wesleyans have big noses. Ken, you must have a big nose. So the fallacy of division is where you take an inessential property of Wesleyans and assume, I've had this, for example, a faculty member whose father was a faculty member at one time. And I know that son did not want to be, my father might be a certain way. Don't assume that I'm that way, because my father's that way, in so many words. So that's the fallacy of division, assuming that because something might be true generally of a certain group, that therefore everybody in that group is a certain way. It works with worldviews too, by the way. There is a certain line of thinking that says that if you believe one part of a worldview, therefore you must believe every part of a worldview. I think most of the time this is just sloppy thinking. That worldviews often have movable parts to them. And of course, people tend to be inconsistent. We tend to be fragmented in our view of the world. And so the idea that if, for example, Ken, you believe in thesis, antithesis, synthesis, therefore you're a Marxist. Well, that would be completely incorrect on many levels. But anyway, so I think that there's some really sloppy fallacy of composition and division that sometimes happens with worldview speak. Well, you'll be glad to know we've come to an end. You should get some kind of prize if you've made it to this part of the video. But this has been my attempt to present to you the basic logical fallacies as part of a philosophy series. Thank you for listening.